Welcome back to The Remote Life. My name is Han Talbot, also known as Han Meets World, and today we'll be chatting with Maya Middlemiss. Based in Spain, Maya is host of the Futurist Freelance Podcast, as well as the founder of Remote Work Europe, a space that enables people to choose where they want to live and contribute to their local communities on their own terms. In this episode, we talk about who Remote Work Europe is for, as well as things people need to know about digital nomads and common misconceptions. Plus, we dive into ways that creative business owners can optimize AI. So grab a coffee, a tea, or something stronger, and let's get started. And we're live on the Remote Life podcast. Maya, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Han. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I'm well, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Me too. It feels like it's been a long time coming.
Yeah. We're planning this for a year or so, but hey, that's all the best things take time.
Exactly. Well, why don't you start things off by telling us about you and your remote life journey so far?
Oh, okay. How long have we got? How long does this show run? Because my remote life journey started, well, technically back in a previous century. I have been working from home, which is what remote work looked like back then, for a very long time. I'm from London originally, and I started working from home due to the arrival of my millennium baby, who's now obviously very much an adult. I can't believe she's going to be 24 shortly, so that is quite a long time. I was employed at the time and working from home on big grey boxes attached to the wall with cables and setting up a market research agency as an employee. I then moved out to the suburbs and then kept moving, wound up in eastern Spain about 15 years ago. Since then, I've been moving around within Spain very slowly, definitely a digital slowmad rather than a nomad. And I'm now fully self-employed for the last 6 years or so as a freelance writer, podcaster, journalist, remote work advocate. Basically, the journey that remote work as a concept has been on over that time has been so exciting and transformative that I want to share that with as many different people as possible. That includes talking to people like your good self at every opportunity, attending events. I host the Futurist Freelance Podcast, and I'm building the Remote Work Europe community.
You are indeed. So that leads me perfectly into my next question. Why don't you tell us more about Remote Work Europe? What is the mission? What is it? Who is it for?
The mission. Well, I think remote work has been something that's been out there in the public subconscious for a long time, as something maybe some other people did, but they did it quite invisibly, especially when most of them were working from home. Then we had 2020 and everything went crazy. And lots of people got their first taste of remote working in a very strange and distorted way because of being in lockdown. Since that time, the interesting thing was then that lots of people learned that they could do their work not in an office. So that was an important learning. But obviously they were doing it often in horrible circumstances where they were having to homeschool and their boss didn't know what they were doing and so on. Now we're at this state of flux where people are being called back to offices. Organisations are trying to figure out their new normality still. And people have gone back to the office. Maybe they didn't like it. Maybe they're craving that freedom they had working from home. They're seeing the digital nomad movement grow and expand. We're seeing this absolute explosion this year of some of the regulatory stuff that underpins mobility, like digital nomad visas, compliance organisations that make it possible to be employed by entities in different countries and so on. So there's all this infrastructure developing and people want it. I want to help them find it. I mean, I've been remote working in Europe for a long time. When I first arrived and people said, how do I get a job doing what you do? I didn't have anything to offer them. But now I can say, okay, you can look at this, you can look here. There are specialist agencies, there are jobs boards, there are these kind of employers, there are all these different spectrums of self-employment. And so that's what I wanted to do, was bring those people together. It started in Spain, really just as a Facebook group a couple of years ago, and the demand for it has grown and grown. So earlier this year, I started to expand and set up communities in other parts of Europe. And I'm still looking. If anybody out there is a Facebook administrator who wants to take on a patch we're not yet got covered, we've got thriving Facebook communities growing also now in Sweden and the UK are both coming along brilliantly. And we're helping people find work, but we're helping them avoid scams. We're helping them showcase their talents. We're helping them promote their services to one another. We've just launched the new website, remoteworkeurope.eu, although EU is not used in a political sense, it's just a domain. So we take a very broad and inclusive view of the European territory because we truly believe that business should be without borders. And so that's what we're all about, is trying to promote and advocate for real remote work.
Love it, love it. And I love the plug as well. That was fantastic. Are you seeing a lot of people out of curiosity kind of in demand, demanding the Spain digital nomad visa? Is there a lot of interest?
Yeah, there is. I mean, there was a huge amount of hype prior to its launch, mainly because it took ages to get launched because, well, that's how things work in Spain, frankly. Don't rush anything bureaucratic. So it came out a lot later than some people were hoping. It also, it got a little bit overhyped in terms of what was on offer. It's basically, Spain is a bureaucratic country. It's a high-tax country. It's not the greatest place for encouraging innovation and risk-taking. So for some people, the digital nomad visa wasn't what they had been hoping for. And it certainly, Spain was not going to do anything that gave them significant advantages over the local self-employed population, which is a huge area in Spain. And there's an awful lot of small businesses and so on. So I can understand why Spain didn't want to roll out a red carpet of very disproportionate conditions to new digital nomads. That said, I know a lot of people have been successful in applying for it. There were definitely hurdles at first, but there are people I'm hearing from more and more now who've managed to figure out the admin of accounting for their social security being paid back in the country of origin or where they might be employed and so on. It's still new. In Spain terms, it's very new. There are a number of specialists helping people get their head around it. We've actually got an event in Remote Work Spain coming up at the end of the month with an immigration specialist reflecting on a year of how it's gone. Right. So I'm looking forward to her insights because I find a lot of people asking me about it and I just send them all to her because I can't do visa advice on any. Yeah. I say, yes, I really hope you manage to figure it out and make it work because it has made it possible for people to come here and bring the work with them, which is what it's all about. And that's a win-win for Spain. Obviously, the income comes in from somewhere else and it means people get to come and live here. So long may it continue.
So true. It's interesting to hear your insights. And you mentioned Sweden is becoming quite popular. Are there any other countries that you're seeing a big demand in?
I think it's one of those things that I don't feel I've got a Europe-wide vision for it yet, which is why I'm trying to recruit new country admins. And the main reason for that is that it's still really fragmented from a regulatory point of view. The rules for being self-employed in Germany compared to Spain, compared to France, and then you add Scandinavia or the Balkans, where there are so many different cultures, so many different languages. I mean, this is why we love Europe, the fact you can drive for a few hours and be somewhere where everything is so different and unique and inspiring and stimulating. But that does make it challenging to try and network across borders in this way. That's why I want to bring this resource together, but it's very, very much a work in progress. And outside of Spain, I need to rely on other people. And that's the reason the UK is probably the fastest growing second area we've got, because at least that's familiar to me. And I've got someone who knows that patch really well. So yeah, it's ongoing. I'd love to think it will all converge and be a unified picture one day, but right now it isn't. And there's a long way to go.
early days, very early days. Do you think, just kind of on that topic, obviously we mentioned visas a little bit, mentioned community a little bit. Is there anything that you think isn't talked about enough when kind of people are taking the leap into remote work and digital nomading?
That's interesting. I think we get an awful lot of people coming into Remote Work Europe who are new to the concept, and we're lucky that Facebook brings people in for us and throws a lot of people into our communities, obviously through their exposing it through their groups programs. So we get people coming in who are remote curious, and often some of the questions are, I'm just say naive, but it kind of reminds me of what a gap there is between those of us who live and breathe this stuff and talk about it all the time, and we know other people who are like us. And so you and I get together in whatever country or conference we fetch up in, and it's easy to assume that remote work has reached that point for everybody, and it hasn't. You know, I seem to spend so much time debunking the same assumptions and myths and scams. I'm working on an ebook at the moment about remote work scams because there are so many horrible exploitations going on for people who are desperate to find remote work because of those lifestyle upgrades it unlocks, which might be things they urgently need, like being able to stay at home and look after somebody or something. And so they're really vulnerable. So there are an awful lot of scams because there's so little understanding. Or I get people, my DMs are full of, first can I have a remote job? But second, how do I get into remote work? What jobs can I get in the remote work industry? That's one of the most frustrating things, is having to explain to people there is no remote work industry. There are so many professional knowledge work roles now which can be performed remotely, but you've got to figure your own way through that. Not only what are you good at and what will someone pay you to do, but what kind of contract can you make between you? What kind of technological support do you need to do that consistently and securely and legally and everything else? That, there isn't anything I can turn around and say to people, here's a remote job, you can do this. You don't need any special skills or experience, because it's just not like that. And for some people, the barriers do seem insurmountable, and there isn't a straight, easy answer to give them. All we can do is try and guide people towards sources of information, how to present themselves to a potential employer, how to consider somewhere in the spectrum of freelancing, because it's not just a case of there's the 9 to 5 at one end and there's complete entrepreneurship at the other. There might be some middle ground where you could consult for a while, or you could take a sabbatical, or you could be an interim, or because of the choices we have now, it's much more complex, it's much more interesting, but it is harder for people to navigate. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we tend to come across, really, is that there's this bucket of remote jobs somewhere that I'm keeping under my desk and I can just give them out to people.
Well, it's like a superpower. Yeah. Like
absolutely. And here's a visa while you're at it. Yeah.
It's so true. And I don't know about you, but I know that I've also kind of gone through this sort of wave in the content creation space as well. It's not about kind of, do you have this extra skill that is kind of unknown and only available for the few? It's sort of, it's not necessarily like, what is this secret remote work job, or like, how is starting a blog a superpower, for example? It's, why do you want to start remote life? Like, what, and just like it was, why do you want to start a blog? Why do you want to start this remote, this group? Why do you want to start an Instagram? Like, and I guess that for me is the big question. I don't know about you, but it's almost like, forget going what you've seen on social media and what you think you should be sort of starting with based on what you've seen on social media or like on the news, whatever it is, and ask yourself what it is about the remote life that you want from it first, and why do you want to go remote?
Yeah. And who might pay you to do that thing? Who's your perfect customer? Where could you actually add some unique value in the world that maybe they can't hire somebody on their own doorstep to do, or maybe it makes sense to work with somebody who's moving around, or maybe it makes sense to work with you because you're the only person in the world who can actually fill that gap. But unless you define that, then, to be brutally realistic about it, why would anybody hire you, a stranger they've never met, to do that work for them? So it's a long way back you have to take people, especially if they want to go down the route of content creation, because there's a lot of us out here now, let's face it. You and I have both carved out our unique niches in this space, and we know many other people who have successfully done so, but I wouldn't say there's a need for a huge amount more in our particular area. What are you going to bring that's brand new? What are you going to bring that's unique? That's what people have to really consider before they decide on their Instagram handle or whatever else before they start making TikToks. Just, hang on a minute. Who are you? What are you bringing here? What's your minimum viable hustle that you're going to offer to the world? And let's package that up first and figure out if there's a market for it.
I suppose it also just goes, I'm curious to know what your why was. But okay, so obviously take the job aspect, put that to one side for a minute. Why you want to go? I've made jokes to people before about like, okay, because of course when you Google the term digital nomad, you normally get a guy on the beach on his back. And if you're any like regular person, I think I've only had one instance where I've actually been able to work on the beach before and the Wi-Fi was decent. That you get this image of this guy chilling out on his laptop, and people assume that that's kind of the lifestyle. And everyone, people would then think, oh yeah, I'd like to spend more time on the beach. And I'm going, okay, wait, hang on. I make jokes that, okay, if all you want to do is sit on the beach, then it sounds like you need a holiday. And that's fine. Like, we all need holidays. We all need breaks. But it's so much more than being able to spend time on the beach in the workday. You've got to have a stronger why for wanting to take up this lifestyle in the first place, because it takes a lot more discipline and self-awareness than I think is talked enough about. And I'm curious to know what that why was for you and your life.
Yeah, I mean, before we're delving into my why, I've got to say I agree 100%. And I think there's an awful lot to blame on the very superficial imagery we have around remote working and digital nomadism and the way social media feeds into that. Actually, beaches are terrible places to try and do any work. Let's face it. I don't think your Apple Care warranty covers sand in the keyboard or being hit by a coconut or any of those things. Hammocks aren't terribly ergonomic workstations. For me, the beach is where you go when you finish work and you close the laptop at the end of the day. And if that means you can choose to do that work in a house near the beach or a cafe or a co-working near the beach, then great. That's what it's about. It's about that choice and that freedom and flexibility. I mean, for me, my why went right back to being pregnant and not wanting to go to somebody else's office and just trying to figure out how on earth I was going to be organised enough to deal with childcare and a career, and never mind the emotional separation of leaving a newborn or a 6-month-old with somebody else and I just couldn't get my head around that. So that was my immediate why. The reason I've kept doing it was because that's all I know now. I realised that I could do it. People say, well, certainly back in those days, how do you find the discipline to work from home? Don't you just get distracted or goof off or watch TV or something? No, of course I don't, because if I don't do this, I can't pay the rent and I can't feed this child and I can't keep doing this. For me, that wasn't particularly a difficult question. So I got over that. All these unexamined things that people used to say before the pandemic, before they had to do it. Don't you just want to do laundry? No. I don't want to do that at the weekends either, so it's really not a problem. Yeah. The reason I've kept doing it, well, I suppose because I've enjoyed so much freedom and choice. I love the fact that I was able to be terrified by the idea of raising teenage daughters in London and say, I think I fancy a small Spanish seaside village instead, and do that. We looked at the Welsh coast for a while and we did some trips out there. I just really wanted a smaller community. And then I thought, hang on a minute, this weather. And realised it was actually cheaper to get from the Costa Blanca than Pembrokeshire. And simply to have that choice. I didn't know anybody else who really had that 15 years ago as a young family. And the fact we were able to do that. And it's something I've fought hard to do at times, fought against social trends, against technology, against all sorts of forces. And I've always been open to innovate, to try new things, to experiment, to problem solve. And I think that's developed characteristics in me, which I didn't necessarily know were there. When I decided to go freelance full-time 6 years ago, I really wanted to make it as a writer, but I soon realised that a lot of what I wanted to write about came from that experience of all those years of remote working, and that in itself was something of value to other people who hadn't had that learning curve. So it became very strongly clear that my why was about helping people to do that and to do it well, to unlock that freedom and everything it had to offer, but in a way that was sustainable and fair and dignified, and to try and get away from some of the things we're seeing now about monitoring and tracking people working from home, which we're seeing at enterprise, the lack of trust that implies, the sheer intrusiveness of it on their own device in their own house. And there's so much bad practice. But these are decisions being made by very senior people who have never had experience of this. And really late in their career was the first time they suddenly had to manage people who weren't in their line of sight. And so they're pushing back and trying to control things that are outside their control and measure all the wrong things. And so there's an awful lot wrong with remote work as it's currently being done in a lot of places. So there's an awful lot of work to do if we want to make this right for people. So that will be my why for as long as I can foresee.
I love that. That's so inspiring. I'm curious, when was your kind of first introduction into the future of work space? The kind of leaders that we know today.
Oh, that's interesting. When I was still employed, but sort of with one foot out of the door because I published a book and I didn't want to do research anymore, I started podcasting with Pilar Ortiz, who is a Spaniard living in London, and her business, Virtual Not Distant, I was a guest on her podcast because I had this weird thing of managing a remote team, which was this was probably 10 years ago or something, where that was still fairly unusual. And Pilar and I kept in touch, and I was blogging and meeting people who were working much more flexibly and creatively than me in the sort of the earlier days of blogging. And I suppose that was, for me, I could see another way of working. And when I did decide I wanted to write full-time, and frankly, I was looking for ways to keep the lights on. And at that point, Pilar said, "Oh, I heard you're free." And she was the first person to say to me, "I want to work with you. I want you to create content for me because you know this space, you know remote team management. You've figured out how to run a remote team when there weren't apps for it, or there wasn't even broadband for it at first. I was phoning people up to tell them what to do." It was, wow. I know, it's just the actual, if you saw the technology that we started to try and communicate and build on. But I mean, it's funny actually how much has changed and yet how little in terms of human communication and what we need. But yeah, I was working as a sort of newly minted freelancer 6 years ago. It was the first time it kind of dawned on me, oh yes, it's not just that I think I'm a good enough writer to make a go of this. This is actually what I know. I thought, I've been stuck in the same career for all these years. What do I know outside of that? But the way I built that business, it turned out, was a useful knowledge asset in its own right. And that was what other people needed from me. It was how did you recruit and hire and train and onboard and manage that team of people working at that point in 3 different countries? And that was the thing people needed. So, oh, yes, okay, I can do that. Yeah, and I can see the results that gets, and I can see that it's helping people. So that made perfect sense. So it was great recording and creating and consulting with Pilar and doing client work. Mostly before the pandemic, it all got more crazy after that.
It accelerated.
Just a little bit.
Love it. So you touched upon sort of some of the common misconceptions earlier, and I'm glad you brought up social media, because I think even when I've been doing this for the best part of 10 years, and I remember being amazed at the day that I could still get Wi-Fi without the Ethernet cable, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's the best thing ever. And I guess also the conversations that even I have with different people around the fact that I have to explain to people this is going to massively. We kind of know some of the stereotypes that we see on, say, Instagram and TikTok about digital nomad life, and then a lot of us are kind of left going, but that's not who we are. That doesn't actually represent a lot of us. Even down to, I know in the last couple conferences that you and I have been at, there has been a lot more conversation about creating possibly communities and conversation around digital nomad travel and remote life for Gen X, for example. What are your thoughts on sort of this misconception have you got any advice for people who are perhaps not millennials and Gen Z? What would you say to them?
Well, I think one thing those of us who are a little bit longer in the tooth probably have to think about even more is you have to earn a living. I think you can probably wing it on a gap year and do a bit of travel, see the sites, tell people you're an influencer or a social media expert or whatever, even if you're actually just burning through a trust fund or something. But if you want to do it sustainably and support a family, you have to have a way to earn a living first. And I think that's the huge gap in an awful lot of the portrayals of digital nomadism in particular is, where's the work? What are people doing? Why aren't we talking about that? Why aren't we explaining the value that you can bring to a client or to an employer? Why aren't we talking about all of the things that people learn by living this lifestyle and how valuable that makes them? The people who used to say to me 20 years ago, "Oh, how do you manage to get anything done at home? I'd be so lazy and distracted." It's like, well, I was actually in my home in a quiet room in the corner of the house. Now there are people running whole businesses sitting in a cafe by the sea or catching up in an airport in a strange time zone. So the discipline, the self-awareness, the self-management that a successful digital nomad entrepreneur brings to their lifestyle and that they've cultivated to support the lifestyle they want to lead, that is incredibly valuable in the workplace. We need to be talking more about that and making it clear to potential employers or hirers that what these people can bring, instead of them being invisible or seen as peripheral, or maybe they're not serious because of, when we hear the word digital nomad, we think of the palm trees on the beach. And obviously this is just something they're filling in time tweeting before they next go surfing or whatever. So, we need to talk about the work more. I think that's really important. We need to highlight that. We need to talk about the skills that people have developed in order to do that and how important they are. Even things like managing your finances, managing your assets on the road. Again, digital nomads and remote workers, you turn up in a new country, you're treated as though you don't exist. You've got no credit rating. You can't get a loan. You can't get a rental contract. You turn up in Spain without a job contract and try and rent an apartment in Valencia. It's like, well, hang on a minute. These remote workers, they're probably earning 3 times what your person with the local job contract is. And how secure is that job contract now, really? At this time where so many people are losing their jobs. The remote workers, they probably had a dozen different jobs in the last couple of years, but that's because they will always find the next one, and they will always find a way to put themselves into something new, to apply their skills in new ways. So we need to find ways of making that more recognised and rewarded and accepted socially. And, it's not just Gen X and older digital nomads and remote workers. Everybody needs that, because people need to have choices in their lives and not just have to choose to live somewhere that's the cheapest because they haven't got any work coming in that month. We need to help people make their lifestyle choices sustainable, and that means people better understanding what they can offer, I think. And maybe accepting that people change as well, that lifestyles and dynamics shift at some point. People might want to settle somewhere, and they need to be able to not think, what do I do about this 10-year gap on my CV and people are going to think I was just wasting time drifting around the world. Instead, how do I highlight what I learned there, what skills I developed, the way I was tested and the way I stepped up, the way I improved myself, which frankly, they probably wouldn't have got a fraction of sitting in an office all that time.
I so agree. I'll never forget on several points that you just mentioned, and I definitely want to come back to a couple of those. But one thing that, funny enough, stuck out on my brain, even when I did my study abroad year, was the fact that people were like, oh, you've just been doing a year-long holiday.
Oh, you're so lucky.
Yeah. Like, never mind that I think my university was one of 2 in the country that still made us do our theses while abroad, or a dissertation if you're from the UK. We had to write it in our target language as well, which again was very unheard of at the time. But the skills I remember I learned from living abroad alone as a student were just invaluable compared to obviously what I'm sorry, my peers who maybe stayed behind, I say in air quotes, were not receiving. So to then go into the digital nomad space or be remote working, and the transferable skills themselves are huge. There's so many soft skills that I feel get overlooked, I think, on a traditional CV, which, I just had to add that in. Yeah, I got very passionate all of a sudden about that.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. It's the fact that you're constantly using those skills in different contexts and figuring out how you can apply what you know in a completely unfamiliar setting develops a flexibility, a resilience, a kind of a self-knowledge that you may never have to develop if you're just delivering somebody else's job description and list of points that someone in HR wrote, and you just go in and do that every day. You've never figured out where your own boundaries are, what you're capable of. So, you're never going to know.
You become proactive, you have self-management skills. There's so many things that I feel like, I suppose, like for people who are maybe going, oh my gosh, like how do I start with what I've learned in my CV, what do I put on my CV? It's those kind of soft skills that make how I put this well, it just makes I would say a valuable worker as well. It's not even about necessarily being self-employed. It's about what you can then contribute to other people's teams and that self.
Definitely. And those are your stories. Those are I interviewed somebody for when I managed a team. One of the first people I recruited out of Europe was a British expat based in Egypt, and there was a gap on her CV I asked about, and she said, well, that was the revolution. It's like, okay, yes, tell me about that then. And everything, her business had collapsed, but she'd had to help her family survive, and it was just like, wow, all right, these are not the kind of things that fit in a traditional job application format, but she had learned and grown so much in that time. I had to put it that way.
It made me thinking of different gaps and whatnot as well. I feel like at the moment I don't know if you've heard about the pandemic skip that's kind of going around as a conversation online. It's just an interesting conversation that I was hearing about, and it's just been coined as this term, the pandemic skip. And I feel like it's almost it came up for me again when we were at World Travel Market last week, because it felt like people were saying, oh, how does 2023 compare to other years? And I was thinking, it feels like this year, after nearly 4 years, travel is back. It's kind of making a very sort of loud effort to be back. after obviously a few years of global shifting, let's put it that way. And with that, of course, I feel like it's the conversation about the pandemic skip is that this sort of our lives were put on pause collectively for a couple of years, right? Through no fault of our own, as it were. And now we're kind of coming out of it. A lot of people were kind of forced to sort of reevaluate things. Some people took breaks. Some people were forced to take breaks and sort of really reevaluate things. And they're kind of coming out of this time. And I know for myself, I felt this a little bit too. And in relation to sort of careers and work, I found that a sort of interesting concept. We're now in this space where we're sort of half mourning the loss of who we were pre-pandemic and sort of that identity and sort of trajectory that we had ourselves on in life, in work, whatever it might be. And then now we have this gap where we're sort of trying to make up for lost time too. And I feel like that's just something I felt like I don't know if you feel that. I don't know if that's something that you maybe would bring into for the remote work conversation.
It's so interesting because I think so many, again, maybe this particularly applies to us who are entrepreneurial, who choose to travel, or we're more hyper aware of this, but we make choices every day. There are paths we could have taken. There are, what if and you could sort of disappear up your own backside with the what ifs, and instead you can only look at the path you chose and all those infinitesimal number of decisions that went before that and the things in your control and not in your control. We're never going to have that time again. If we ever have a similar incident, the world will react very differently simply because it will be the second time. And maybe that did create a unique time for people to pause, to reevaluate. I know for a lot of people that I talk to now who are coming newly into the remote work space, it was the first time they questioned that trajectory they were on. It was the first time that maybe they've been very happy with a fairly predictable linear career with certain expected outcomes in terms of accomplishment and income or whatever at the end of it. And it was the first time that they had turned upside down all of those assumptions and realized that there could be other ways of doing things. So we can see it as a pause. We can see it as a change of direction. We can see it as turning everything upside down. But for other people, it opened up new possibilities that were always there, but they just couldn't see them, including all the people over the years who said to me, I could never work from home. That just wouldn't suit me. Or my job couldn't be done like that. I need to be around other people or whatever. And then suddenly once they had that unlock, all these other possibilities cascade out then. Well, and what if I didn't have to stay in my home? What if we weren't in lockdown? What if? And so actually far from being a hiatus, it's more of an opening up, certainly post-pandemic, that hopefully people can skip forward over that time and into a new world of possibilities. And I don't mean that to sound really naive and Pollyanna-ish. I do really recognise it was a horrendously difficult time for the world in general and for lots of individuals and for lots of families. It's a time of loss, of grieving, of real financial hardship. But even stripping away all of the superficialities of life, I think it left some people with new things to consider, new priorities maybe, the things they thought were important to work towards before, the status or the income or whatever. Maybe some of that became less important and they were able to think what they really wanted, what they really missed, the people that they really missed. Maybe that was more important than the job or the commute or everything else. Where were they craving to be? Who did they really want to be around that they couldn't during that time? So it was, I don't know if we'll ever have anything like that again. I mean, God, I hope not. I'm certainly not wishing that. But as a collective pause and intake of breath for the whole world to just really think about things. I know it affected people so differently. For some people, it was just, I can stay in my pajamas and make banana bread and still not really question anything. For other people, it was just so transformative. We're only really beginning to see the outcomes of that as it reshapes the whole world now.
I think that's why I bring it up. It's more also, I guess, that for a lot of people who, I know even for myself, I've been on off remote for 10 years, right? And I've been like banging the remote work drum for goodness knows how long. But I know even for myself, I was on a very specific trajectory that within a few months of lockdown, I was questioning massively and I actually completely flipped it on its head. And I'm sure that for a lot of people, like, again, not to make light of the situation, but of course there will be some people who are now coming out of the pandemic still kind of questioning what's next. And I guess it's utilising, like, being able to describe that pandemic skip as something that then you can take and turn into a positive for and utilise to your advantage in this kind of post-pandemic world that we've never had to navigate, at least in our lifetime, before as well.
And it is a changed world, you know, whether it's all those people going back to the office, but still with their new collaboration skills and their ring lights and their contacts and their comfort with that kind of collaboration now, or the people who, again, on the other side of it, there are people who are really nostalgic, and I think it's very easy to slip into that trap as well. We actually moved house during lockdown, which is not something I recommend, but we were committed to it just before. It's a long story, but we ended up changing to another city, and then obviously we couldn't go back and visit anyone for months and months and months, it turned out. And we found that we were quite nostalgic about, sometimes should we have left? And yeah, it was lovely there and things. And then realising after a while that it's not that town I miss, it's 2019. I want to kind of roll back the clock to then and, the age that our girls were and the group of friends there, and some of them have left and some of them have moved on, and what you can't do is go back ever. And you need to recognise that, things have changed, but there's lots of good about the change too. And each of us has changed individually, and we can make the best of what we've got now and look forward and find new ways to put that together and embrace the possibilities that offers us. Remember, we'd never heard the word digital nomad visa back in 2019. We'd never heard of employers of record. We'd never, there's so many things now on the table to support remote work. We never heard of 5G, except it was going to give us all COVID, or so I can't remember. All of these things that are making it possible for us to live and work wherever we choose are exploding into the world because of the vacuum that was created then.
As obviously I mentioned before, we started recording, of course, that even my hometown here in the UK is advertising itself as a laptop friendly cafe. Like, that would never have happened. I remember pre-pandemic when I was like, oh my gosh, I can actually get on some Wi-Fi and have a nice coffee. Like, that in itself was just a novelty. Now we have whole cafes popping up in the high street itself. It's turning into a social space for people to take a break from the office, for example, or actually go and work.
And have people moved to that town now who used to live in big commuter cities? Have people, are you in a Zoom town? I heard the BBC calling them recently.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, it was already a commuter town, but I imagine now that London's been, so I'm from Surrey originally, which is a region just south of London. And I'd say over the last couple decades, London's slowly been moving down and out of London itself. So it'd be interesting to see that development for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I know that some rural cities in the UK or coastal cities have been really reinvigorated by people moving and staying year round post-pandemic because they've been able to, or people who've had second homes that they only use for a fortnight in the summer are now able to spend a lot more of the year in communities that need professional income people spending money there and going to the cafes and buying the lattes and shopping in the shops and going to the nightclubs and everything else. So, I think it's the social changes. Some of them are going to take decades, actually, not even just years, because a lot of them depend on commercial real estate lease cycles. So we are talking decades before we start to see the real second, third, fourth order effects of all of this. And there will be losers as well, let's face it, not least those commercial real estate leaseholders. But eventually things will redistribute and settle down. And I think, the way that a lot of countries look and the way that cities work, the way that urban sprawl and commuting and everything else has become so strangely unbalanced, the insanity of rents in places like London and Barcelona, all of that's going to settle down to, I don't know what we're going to end up with, but it's going to be interesting to watch it coming.
For sure, it's one of those things that I'm so fascinated by, and I guess again, I remember obviously back, well over 10 years ago now, when people were starting to worry, of course, about the disappearance of the high street. And obviously, back for anyone who doesn't know what a high street is, it's kind of essentially what the main street of shops in a British town, I guess, is the best way to describe it. And then I was working with some guys in retail 6 years ago now, I think it is. And they were saying, no, it's not going to be about the disappearance of the high street. It's not going anywhere. What it's going to do is change into experience. And of course, post-pandemic especially, we're now craving that social interaction. So there's now more coffee shops and spaces where we can actually be and just hang out together now popping up, which I'm finding fascinating for sure.
I definitely agree, yes, because I don't visit the UK that often now. And when I do go back, it's sort of a bigger gap, so you can see bigger changes. And I'm definitely seeing the high streets. Pre-pandemic, it had reached a point where it was all kind of pound shops, real discount retailers, or really luxury. That just such a sort of income disparity in lots of towns around the country where it was sort of dog manicurists and things, sort of insane luxury next to things catering to extreme poverty and not much in between. That's what seemed to have hollowed out, because maybe all those people were shopping online from their commuter train in the morning. And now I'm starting to see more local retailers and small local businesses. There's this concept of 15-minute cities and being able to walk to places, being able to find everything you need within that walking distance in your neighbourhood, and that including not just retail, but leisure facilities, social, nightlife, hospitality, and everything that you need within that area. And that's what's going to give us back our communities. And so it's very much a work in progress still, but I'm starting to see those trends in the UK, in Spain, and in other places. And I hope that's a direction that we'll continue to travel in. It just takes a lot of different kind of planning and things to come together. There needs to be a commitment to that kind of suburban redevelopment, not pouring everything into the city centres, because people don't want to go there anymore. They don't want to go there with 400 other people in one train carriage anyway.
Oh, yes, amen to that. And I was going to say also, I feel like it's such a, outside of the UK, and I'm obviously very biased in saying this, but when I go abroad, I feel like experience is so much more readily available, even down to just being able to sit and have a coffee. Like cultures like Croatia, for example, have whole words and concepts. Like Sweden has fika, like the whole concept of having coffee and a cinnamon bun with friends. Like there are whole cultures round being able to just be with people you care about. So I'm intrigued and excited for how it can potentially look in other cultures like the UK, for example, where that's not so readily available, and how that could possibly be integrated. Because it's one of those things, it's one of the reasons why I love going to other countries is the experience. It's being able to feel like you're a part of something. So yeah,
definitely. Even these linguistic things, it's like the fabled 50 Inuit words for snow or something, which there isn't, but it's kind of the more ways that a culture describes socializing or interacting suggests that it's something that does have a lot of emphasis and differentiation within that culture. And if you have a special word for socializing over coffee, then you can bet that that's an important thing to do, and you're going to do it well. I love the Spanish concept of sobremesa, of lingering over the table after a meal. And so don't plan to do anything Sunday afternoons, because the conversation will just carry on until it gets stuck. So it shouldn't be any different. So in the UK, they'd be sort of clearing the table or putting the football on or something. In Spain, everybody just sits and chats. And that's an important part of that culture. And that is one of the things that you only observe when you travel, because you can hold your own experiences of what you grew up with up against something else and realise that something you thought was a norm is actually just a habit, and it's just a local thing. It's not universal. That suggests so many different things, and that's what makes it so interesting. So long may it continue.
Exactly, for sure. And you mentioned a couple of things already, but what is like one of your favourite sort of traditions or norms that you've picked up while on your travels that you've integrated into your everyday life?
That's interesting. I think I've got very clear about when I do my best work, and I'm a morning person when it comes to work. So I do tend to keep afternoons free for cultural things wherever I am, whatever I'm doing in the world. You're not going to find me doing anything productive after lunchtime. There I'm much more likely to be exploring or checking out the local coffee shops or something. So I think that's one of it's not a tradition anywhere particular, but it's one of those things I like to keep the same wherever I am, I suppose. And yeah, it's always interesting to find different people and doing different things. I always try to find something like an art gallery or a science museum or something just to compare in new cities, and try and find check out local cuisine as well. That's always something I want to do, though it can be challenging as a non-meat eater.
I was going to say that's such a relatable concept, I think. Just in general, where there's food, where you'll most likely find most of us at.
Well, it feels like a sort of polite cultural thing too. It's something we bond over, and yet it's so different everywhere. So there's something very connecting about hospitality, about going somewhere where they feed you and offer you food, or if you're a guest somewhere, what do they offer you? And the first thing I would offer if somebody comes to my house, and comparing those differences, that's very levelling and yet very differentiating. I suppose that's endlessly fascinating in a small, really accessible, inexpensive, quick way, is what do you have with your coffee?
Oh, for sure. Very important follow-up question from that, of course. What do you have with your coffee?
Usually just more coffee, to be honest. I'm not a breakfast person. Or whatever the local recommendation is. And that's often something, if I'm in a new city or a new country, I'll ask, what's the local speciality? Usually some kind of sweet carby thing, which seems to complement a black coffee delightfully. But that could be a croissant, or it could be some kind of buñuelo, or depending, like within Europe, it could be so many different things. So I'll take advice. Whatever I see the locals enjoying, it'd probably be worth a try.
I can always taste what it, like that biscotto or whatever it is, like on the tip of my tongue right now. Oh, love it. Flipping the conversation around a little bit from cultural fluffy things to another thing that kind of has been more and more of a conversation, and as I like to joke, is my new Roman Empire. To be honest, again, I don't know if you've heard that Roman Empire trend thing on social media.
Yeah, tell me about that then. What's your Roman Empire?
Oh, goodness sake, yeah. So for anyone who hasn't gone down the rabbit hole of the Roman Empire conversation, it's the concept is ask any of your guy friends or partners about how often they think about the Roman Empire. Okay. And apparently, I've yet to actually talk to a guy who does, funnily enough, but apparently there's now this joke about, okay, this particular concept is my Roman Empire. It's something I think about every day, and it's become my Roman Empire. My Roman Empire has become AI.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's about as all-powerful as the Roman Empire, but will it go into the same state of decay in a few centuries? We'll have to see.
It's for some reason, apparently a lot of guys still think about Roman Empire and the concepts of the Roman Empire. Well, for me, that's AI. And AI seems to come up in my inbox in conversations every day. And I know that it was something that you did a brilliant talk about at the Nomad World Summit in Albufeira a few weeks ago. And I was just curious if you could just tell us a bit more about that for people who obviously didn't get the opportunity to hear it, and your advice, I guess, for anyone who is thinking about how to use AI as a creative business owner.
I think every business owner who wants to be successful, especially if they're a solopreneur, they have to use whatever the latest technological tools out there are, and they have to stay across whatever is out there and what's coming as well. And this year it is just all about AI, and you can't not think about it every 5 minutes, or at least every day, because this is the world we're living in, and it permeates everything. I know that my perspective on it is probably skewed even further because I write for technology startups, and they've been talking about this for ages, but now it's like soaked into every conversation everywhere. I think it's going to have a huge impact on remote work because it's going to take away a lot of the easier options, a lot of the entry-level stuff that people got started on. And it probably was, 10 years ago, you could say, right, I'm going to be a copywriter or whatever, and just do a few courses and get out there and start picking up paid work. Now, a lot of that entry-level stuff is going to go to automation now. Nobody is going to pay you to write basic product descriptions or make simple logos or, all of those things. You're going to either hire somebody who's really expert in their field, who's got years of experience and brings some instinct and strategy to it, or you're going to automate it on the cheap. I think it's going to be very difficult for humans to do the lower end stuff. So I think the main impact on us as freelancers and remote workers is we've got to raise our game. We've got to add human value to that service as well. It's not enough just to program the app. You have to help figure out what problems the app is going to solve for humans, and you have to be able to add value to your proposition at that level. You have to be developing content strategy to serve the needs of a particular human audience rather than just banging out content, because a machine can now bang out content and it's pretty good and it's going to get better. So I think these are the things that are here already and they're coming. And there's always been an edge between what the machines can do and what the humans can do. And there's always been a window of opportunity at that edge to be the interface between the human and the machine, to move the conversation in different directions, to find ways to bridge the gap between the people who say, oh, I'm not into technology or whatever. But I think there are going to be businesses who say, oh, we don't really like that AI stuff, but they're going to go the same way as the ones 20 years ago who said, oh, we're not really an IT company. No, the people said, I don't think we want one of those website things. What happened to that? There is no such thing as a business that hasn't got a website now. So there's not going to be any such thing in 5 years as a business that doesn't use AI, or as a freelancer who doesn't use it and who doesn't have to work with it rather than against it or instead of it. So people have got to educate themselves. They've got to try and stay up to date and informed on all this. They've got to try and figure out what the machines can't do and what the humans need to work with the machines and add value together. And also let the machines do the boring stuff. Let them take away the proofreading or the data analysis or all the stuff that's incredibly time consuming. I think it's going to be really important to learn how to use the tools to get rid of that so that we can focus on the bits that only we can do.
I think it sounds exactly like, because I remember the whole the conversations with social media as well. Like businesses were very slow to take up social media accounts. And yeah, of course, now you expect companies to be on TikTok and doing well, for example. And it sounds a lot like, and I guess that's where for me, especially hearing your talk, it was quite reassuring that it's not about sort of going against it. It's about utilising it to optimise what you do, to streamline what you do. Even if that's I know for me, for example, I can put my hands up and say, I run out of ideas sometimes for different things, and it's helpful for this machine to bring up a few new ideas for posts or whatever it is, because we are humans and we get tired. So we're allowed to get help, as you would with anything.
Absolutely. And what you can use these tools for is to plug your gaps and your weaknesses. Don't use them to try and compete on your strengths, because that's a zero-sum game. You've got to use them to free up your time to double down on your strengths and to do the bits that you find boring or repetitive or just not in your zone of excellence. I wrote up an article this morning which was based on an interview with a startup founder. There's absolutely no way an AI could have done that. They couldn't have interviewed them and asked the questions and put the story together. But what I did do at the end was paste the article into ChatGPT and say, give me 10 titles, because I'd got to the point where I just couldn't write or think anymore about this product or this person or this conversation. And I couldn't think of a good journalistic sort of short bit with a colon and then the next bit that I knew I wanted the structure of the title to take. And I knew I'd know it when I saw it. And so, ChatGPT spat me back 10 examples. I actually chose the beginning part of one and the second part of another. And I thought that'll work. Then I Googled it to make sure it was unique, and it served the SEO perfectly. I thought, that's the title done. And that took me about a minute and a half. Whereas this title had been mulling all morning writing this thing. What am I going to just title? And in the end, I was able to just say, right, put that out of my mind, because I know I can get help on that. It's like having somebody around, like a smart, or not always, sometimes a bit stupid VA to just say, right, give me another perspective on this. It's only as smart as the information you give it, but actually it's very good at stringing up headlines. And all of those other 9 could be used as tweets or something else. They were all good in different ways, and different ways of looking at the same material, which I wouldn't necessarily have thought of. So it's really useful for stuff like that.
Is there any, aside from ChatGPT, are there any other apps that you like to use that kind of have an AI?
I use Midjourney for graphics. I'm starting to use, now that DALL-E is built, into ChatGPT, I've started dabbling with that again more, just so I don't have to open two things. It's just if the tab's already there. But I quite like Midjourney because I do write about often quite conceptual, futuristic stuff. And if I just want an image to go with social media, it's if I can just describe it in words, and the machine can spit back 4 different visions of what that might look like. And I can say, yeah, actually, number 3, that's kind of it. Just make it a bit more blue or whatever I think it needs, or make it more sparkly. And then that's something to accompany a LinkedIn post, for example, or a blog article that's completely unique. And I'm not a pictures person at all, never have been. But if I can describe an image in words, that's using what I'm good at. And then the machine does what it's good at and gives me a picture that I didn't know I wanted. And I say, yeah, that's perfect. And so other people might be the other way around. They'll paint a picture and an AI will turn that into an article or something. But, it's a very powerful thing that can work in both directions.
Love it. Final question, Maya. Fill in the blank. Home is where?
Oh, that's a good one. Home is where my family is, I think. And that in itself is a bit of a moving target at the moment, because I'm at the life stage where my nest is emptying. My nuclear family is becoming smaller, or it's becoming more dispersed. So I've now got one daughter living semi-permanently in the UK. So I can say, obviously, it's home when I go and visit her. But I know that if I'm traveling, especially if I'm on my own, I am very much a homebody. Even though I love to travel, I love to come home as well. And as you know, it's where my husband is, where my cats are, where my girls are. That's where home is. And it's a safe, happy base from which to travel anywhere in the world.
Love it. Maya, thank you so much for chatting to me today. It's been amazing, as always.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Remote Life, and thank you, Maya, for taking the time to speak with us. You can find links to her profiles below. Thank you so much again for listening, and we can't wait to remote work with you again soon.